How's everybody feeling on this Friday? Thank you. Clap it up for Friday. For those of you who are just joining the Hip Hop Symposium for the first time in this hour, you missed a lot, but welcome to WPU's first Hip Hop and Higher Education Symposium. We have a lot in store for you this afternoon. First, you will hear from Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. We also have a cipher immediately after this keynote, which is taking place in our gym due to the rain. I have plenty of volunteers to show you where that is, so stay tuned for that as well. I just want to bring you greetings again for those who are just joining us. I am Stephanie Reed, the Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I provide you greetings from my office and from William Peace University. But to provide you more formal greetings, I would like to offer the podium to Dr. Brian Ralph, WPU's president.
Well, good afternoon, and I just want to extend my own personal welcome. It has been an incredible couple days here so far. Can we give a huge shout out to Stephanie and Janelle for an amazing program? So as you all know, we have explored some incredible topics and more are yet to be discovered. I had the chance to sit in on the panel today at lunch, which was just incredibly invigorating and challenging and eye-opening and all the things you want a panel like that to be. And so I also want to make sure that we recognize we've got a number of faculty, staff, and senior leadership team here in the audience today. If you all could just stand so we can recognize you, we're really grateful for all your support. So faculty, staff, leadership team, great, thank you. Awesome. So as you all know, we are in for a treat this afternoon. We have an incredibly accomplished speaker, and Stephanie's going to be introducing Dr. Hill in just a few seconds. The last thing that I want to say is that you'll remember when I opened our, which I can't believe it was only yesterday, when I opened the symposium, I challenged you with a couple of things. First and foremost was to engage. The second was to listen. The third was to think, and then I added on at the end, have fun. In my observation so far, you all have risen to that challenge and accomplished all of those. So kudos to you for embracing all of those opportunities and those challenges. I know we've got a couple really exciting things to close out our symposium. So again, for our guests and also for our students, faculty, and staff, welcome to this afternoon session. It's been a pleasure to have this incredible symposium here on campus, and we're looking forward to finishing strong. So I'll turn things back over to Stephanie to introduce our incredible speaker this afternoon.
So, a couple quick housekeeping notes before I introduce Dr. Hill. Remember, when you came in, I hope that you received a red ticket. We have one final raffle for a pair of Dreamville tickets. That will happen after the keynote and the Q&A with Dr. Hill, so please hold on to your tickets. Also, if you are so moved by what you hear from Dr. Hill and you are sharing on social media, the hashtag is running behind me. Don't forget that hashtag. Thank you very much. And without further ado, another quick note. I would like to extend a very, very warm and fervent thank you to our sponsors. We had two wonderful sponsors, one being Sodexo, our food service company. Please thank you to Sodexo with me. And I would also like to thank our other partner and sponsor, Alpha Graphics, who provided us with all of our print materials. Thank you, Alpha Graphics. A little bit about Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is one of the leading intellectual voices in the country. He is currently the host of BET News, an award-winning journalist. Dr. Hill has received numerous prestigious awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Dr. Hill is the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University. Prior to that, he held positions at Columbia University and Morehouse College. Since his days as a youth in Philadelphia, Dr. Hill has been a social justice activist and organizer. He is a founding board member of My Fifth, a nonprofit organization devoted to educating youth about their legal rights and responsibilities. He is also a board member and organizer of the Philadelphia Student Union. Dr. Hill also works closely with the ACLU Drug Reform Project, focusing on drug enforcement policy. Over the past few years, he has actively worked on campaigns to end the death penalty and to release numerous political prisoners. Ebony Magazine has named him one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. Dr. Hill is the author or co-author of 4 books: the award-winning Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip-Hop Pedagogy and the Politics of Identity, The Classroom and the Cell, Conversations of Black Life in America, the New York Times bestseller, and my personal favorite, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond, and Gentrifier. He has also published 2 edited books, Media, Learning, and Sites of Possibility, and Schooling Hip-Hop, New Directions in Hip-Hop-Based Education. As you can hear, he clearly was the best keynote speaker for this 2-day hip-hop symposium. Trained as an anthropologist of education, Dr. Hill holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education in the United States and the Middle East. I would just like to personally add, it warms my heart to bring someone who is so connected and deeply cares for both what's happening in his neighborhoods. Being from Philadelphia myself, I am proud to welcome a Philadelphia native, but he also cares deeply about international affairs, and I'm super duper excited to welcome a homeboy for me and a scholar, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Good afternoon. It is so good to be here with you all today, and it's so good to be part of such an important event. These days I spend most of my time talking about politics and issues of social justice and culture, and it's rare that I get the opportunity to talk and think about hip-hop culture in the same ways that I used to. I still listen to it. I still engage it, but I don't necessarily get the opportunity and the space to do this in as much as I did at the beginning of my academic career 15 years ago when I became a professor. And to do it with y'all is incredibly exciting. It's incredibly rewarding. And I want to make sure that we talk for a bit and then we find plenty of time to have questions and answers as well, because the conversation about hip hop right now is fascinating. I hope you all have done this throughout the time, though. Can we just take a moment and have a moment of silence for Nipsey Hussle? Thank you. It's sort of eerie when I got the news last week that Nipsey had been killed. I haven't done much else but think about it. It's been devastating. Anybody who's ever had the privilege of meeting Nipsey Hussle, anybody who's had the opportunity to engage him, knows the type of spirit that he is, the type of person that he was, the type of love that he had for his people, for his community, for his family, for his friends. And to see such a young life wiped out so suddenly, so unnecessarily, so absurdly, is nothing short of devastating for an entire community. And I gotta say, it took me back. When I teach classes on hip hop sometimes, and when I teach a Nas Jay-Z class, and it's weird because when I first taught the Nas Jay-Z class, that was like the cool class to take. That was like the class you took when you wanted to find out about the music you was listening to. And now my students weren't born when Nas and Jay-Z started rapping. And it makes me really uncomfortable. It makes me feel really old. And we would talk about the Biggie and Pac beef, and the Biggie and Pac beef was an interesting one, and it began in the mid-'90s, and when Pac is killed in September of '96, I was a freshman at Morehouse College. So I know they wasn't alive then, my freshman. And the feeling that I had this week is very similar to the feeling I had in September of '96 when Pac was killed, and that feeling I had that winter in March when Biggie was taken from us as well. It was the feeling of loss. It was the feeling of generational despair. It was the sense of absurdity that someone who we connected to was so quickly and so unnecessarily taken from us. And it was hard for the world to wrap its mind around why a group of young folk who had never met Pac, who had never met Biggie, could be crying. I mean, people, especially I had a roommate from LA. I mean, he was crying for he took it a little too hard. He was crying for 6 months. He ain't finished freshman year. But but in general, people were crying and they were upset and they were devastated. Even the faculty, I'm at Morehouse, so everybody was black just about. The black faculty even were like, why would you be so upset at the loss of somebody you ain't met yet? Trying to reconcile that, trying to explain that to them as a 17-year-old was challenging for me. How could I explain to them why Pac meant so much for me, meant so much to me, if I didn't know who he was, if I didn't meet him? I could still listen to the music they said. I could still watch the videos. You ain't know him, why are you upset? But the connection that black folk and young people have in creative culture to artists like Biggie, artists like Pac, artists like Kendrick, artists like Drake, artists like Fonte, artists who radically reshape their imaginations, who they can see in different form, who offer them lessons about life. These are things that are bigger than music. Hip-hop culture, as we've been talking about in this symposium and as scholarship has taught us, is bigger than music. It's a cultural movement. It's a cultural practice. It's a way of living. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a habit of body. It's a habit of mind. Hip-hop is so rich and so nuanced and so thorough that it demands an investigation. But to be honest, hip-hop in higher education is something that we ain't talk about 20 years ago, not easily. Remember, when I get my PhD in 2005 and I said I was going to write my thesis on hip-hop culture, people said, don't do that. You ain't going to get no job. These are people who cared about me. Sometimes people tell you stuff because they hate me. These people were like, no, we want you to get a job. We think you're smart. We think you're capable. We think you're talented. But there's no space for hip-hop in the university. And the reason they said that is because there's a long history of disconnecting black culture and black cultural production, black ideas and black thought from the university. And that's where I want to start my conversation today. Hip-hop studies is an intervention into a very long-standing university and really American and even largely Western practice of divorcing black experience from the realm of ideas. Black folk have never had a shortage of ideas. Black folk have never had a shortage of stories, but there is an epistemological turn in the West and during the Enlightenment era that reinforms or even concretizes this idea that black folk don't have the capacity for original thought and original ideas. And so to take black ideas and study them in the academy, if we're going to do that, we're not going to study them from the perspective of black folk because black folk don't have the ability to shape those ideas. We can make sense of black folk, but only through white lenses. This is the idea that the Western Academy wants you to believe. The Enlightenment era emerges in folk like Hume and Kant. They're making the argument that black folk don't have the ability to engage in original intellectual production. This is the argument. Remember when Phyllis Wheatley writes poems on various subjects, religious and moral, they said, well, Phyllis Wheatley, we want you to publish this book, but the problem is we can't publish the book unless you have subscribers. There was no Amazon back then. You couldn't just put the book on the net. So you put the book out, you needed at least 100 people to say they was going to buy the book ahead of time. And when it was time for Phyllis Wheatley to produce this book, they said, nobody will buy this book from you, woman, girl, slave, Senegalese, Wolof tribe. Nobody's going to buy this stuff from you because nobody believes you could have written it. So Phyllis Wheatley got this book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, and she's writing elegies for fallen American soldiers. She's writing letters to General George Washington. She's writing poems like the very famous On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy that brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there is God and a Savior too. Problematic poem, to be sure, because it suggests that deliverance comes in America and that the pagan land was Africa. We can be mad at the poem, but we should be able to read it. That's what free speech is about, right? Allegedly. But their problem wasn't the content of the poem, it was the authorship itself. They said you could not have written this poem. They said these ideas can't come from somebody like you, because Hume said that there is no record of intellectual originality among African people. There is talk of maybe one Negro in Jamaica, but he is like a parrot. Phyllis Wheatley herself is being addressed by Thomas Jefferson in Notes on Virginia. He said Christianity could produce Phyllis Wheatley, but it couldn't produce a poet. They put Phyllis Wheatley on trial so that her poetry would be examined to see if she really did it. Because she's writing in Latin. This 16-year-old woman owned by the Wheatley family is speaking Latin and Greek. She knows the so-called great books. She's writing elegant letters. She's using the best of the Western tradition to articulate a particular worldview of Africanity. She's taking Western stuff and baptizing it in the waters of Africa. This is what hip hop is. And she's doing this with aplomb. She's masterful at it. But they said, ain't no way you did that. They got her on trial. You got folk like the Oberlin family, the Welsleys. These names sound familiar? Go to Oberlin College, go to Wellesley University. Or Wellesley College, right? They decided that, okay, fine, you wrote it, but it's mimetic. They said it's mimetic. What does that mean? They said, yeah, it's original, but you just stole someone else's style. That was Jefferson's point. Okay, Christianity made Phyllis Wheatley. The Bible created you, but it didn't create a poet because you're not original. So her genius could not be understood through the lens of the West. Slaves write slave narratives. And they're called slave narratives. You read David Walker's Appeal, a preamble together with 4 articles to the colored citizens of the world, but particularly most especially those of the United States. It's a masterful text. But through the lens of the West, it could only be understood as a slave document, as a story. But then you pull up philosophers like Lewis Gordon who say, no, this is a piece of Africana existentialism. This is existential philosophy. But they said, nah. They didn't say it was existential philosophy. No, you don't say. No, nobody on a plantation whose labor was being exploited, who was working 22 hours a day, said, I am about to write a piece of existential philosophy. But that don't mean it wasn't that. And there are many white writers, many white philosophers who have articulated narratives, but those narratives are called a part of the existential canon, despite the fact that they don't self-identify. But with black folk, that's not allowable. And so we end up with a division of labor within the American university that says that black folk bring experience and white folk bring theory. What we have to be able to do is understand that the articulation of black voices, of black cultural workers, of black creators is also a piece of intellectual production. It ain't just experience. There's something deeper there. When Lauryn Hill says, I loved hard once, but the love wasn't returned. The man I thought I'd die for wasn't even concerned. Time had turned. He tried to burn me like a perm, though my eyes saw the deception. My heart wouldn't let me learn for some dumb woman was I. Every night he would lie and then cry, and inside I'd die. Some of y'all can understand that. Some of y'all need a drink now. But as you move through the text and she talks about pain suppressed leads to cardiac arrest. Diamonds deserve diamonds. He convinced me I was worth less. I compared myself to Toni Braxton, thought I'd never catch my breath. But at the end, she says, I was God's best, contemplating death with a Gillette. But no man is ever worth the paradise manifest. Let's sit with that for a second. And this all comes together, I promise. We could easily, like we did with Phyllis Wheatley, take Lauryn Hill and dismiss it. We could say, okay, you wrote it, but you ain't write nothing of substance. Or you wrote something, but we need the West to be able to interpret what you wrote. Or we could begin to understand the text on its own terms. So yeah, I could look at the text and say, well, you say, compare myself to Toni Braxton, thought I'd never catch my breath. That is an allusion to Toni Braxton's song Breathe Again, 1996, 5, something like that. Sure, cool, shout out to Babyface, right? We could make it that simple, right? I was God's best, contemplating death with a Gillette, the razor. She killing him, she killing herself. My students debate this as we analyze the text all the time. Neither's good, I'm not arguing for either case. But we could talk about narrative closure and how it's framed. Sure. There's all kinds of ways that the American Academy could make sense of that text, or make sense of Phyllis Wheatley, or make sense of John Coltrane, or make sense of Aretha Franklin within the context of its own, within the context of Western structures. But what hip hop in the Academy is trying to do is say, wait a minute. We don't need to analyze you on your terms, but rather we can begin to articulate a framework and a narrative that enables us to understand hip-hop culture and the broader sweep of African intellectual and cultural production on its own terms. We don't need to look at you through the lens of the West. We can look at ourselves through our own terms from our own standpoint and make our own determinations about what's good and what's bad, about what's hot and what's not, about what's high quality work and what's low quality work. We're allowed to do that within our own intellectual and cultural frameworks. And so when we begin to do that, people say, wait a minute, this ain't rigorous. This isn't real academic work. This doesn't cohere with any of our theoretical frameworks. This doesn't connect to any of our literatures. You don't say. It ain't supposed to. That doesn't mean there's not resonance. But I don't need postmodernity. I don't need postmodern literary theory to understand the signifying monkey. I don't need postmodern literary theory to understand the various ways that our African cultural products play with sound and sight and are polyvocal and play with irony and have a kind of pastiche, a connection of different styles and how there's a certain kind of kitsch to it in a way that we might revere that which is old in a way that plays with or resurrects dead styles. I don't need post-structural theory to be able to understand the idea that we might be adjudicating between different truth claims by saying that there might not be a foundational element of truth upon which all other truth claims are situated, but rather that black folk may understand that two things can be true at the same damn time. There might be a way to do that without y'all. And by y'all, I mean those who fetishize the Western canon. And there's nothing wrong with the Western canon. I was trained in the Western canon. I understand the Western canon. I find value in the Western canon. I'm saying it can't be the only game in town. And sometimes the biggest purveyors and proselytizers of the Western canon ain't white folk, but black folk. Some of y'all think they theory just smarter. They ice just colder. But there might be a different way to think about this. To do that, what do we have to do? First, we have to situate this within a context of history. It's hot in here. Jesus. Y'all not hot? Maybe I'm running my mouth. All right. I was about to, but I didn't know what was under this hoodie. Like, I didn't know what the T-shirt said. Yeah, you saw me, I was like, let me see what this joint say. All right, we good, yeah, I'm hot, if y'all don't mind. So the first thing we have to do is understand hip hop within its historical context. We have to see it as part of what Melville Herskovitz, again, if you're going to dip it a little bit in the West, talks about as the deification of accidents. Specifically, what I want us to think about is the way that hip hop culture emerges out of the rubble of post-industrial urban America. Hip hop was created from the voices and the work, the labor, the sacrifice of black and brown youth in New York City. They weren't at an after-school program, because there wasn't one. They weren't in their classrooms with instruments, because they ain't had no instruments. They weren't spending that grant money, because they ain't getting none. These were young black and brown youth in New York City who had been marginalized, pushed out of public space. We saw the rise of anti-loitering statutes. They were not allowed in school spaces after school because after-school programs were shutting down more and more. There was a decline in music programming. There were fewer resources to them. And these kids, they didn't pick up guns. Not these kids. They didn't pick up knives. Instead, they picked up their grandmama's records. They picked up James Brown. They picked up Coltrane. They picked up Maceo Parker. They picked up more James Brown. They picked up Fela Kuti. They picked up Marvin Gaye. They picked up more James Brown. And they kept going. And they put together a set of sounds that themselves reflect a sensibility around African cultural production. The idea of sampling is in and of itself an African cultural practice. Don't think about it purely as a postmodern practice like a Russell Potter would argue, and he ain't wrong that it can be looked at through the lens of postmodernity, but that ain't the only way to understand it. Rather, I want you to understand that African people have always been piecing stuff together. In America, see the debate in the early part of the 20th century between people like E. Franklin Frazier, the sociologist, and Melville Herskovitz, the anthropologist, was whether or not African people had continued to hold on to African practices once they got to America. E. Franklin Frazier was saying, no, that ain't true. What happened was when black folk came to America, they lost their African stuff. And Herskovitz said, nah, bruh. Ironically, Herskovitz was white. But he's like, nah, bruh. Black American cultural practices have retained African features to it. When you go, the call and response of church and the people of God said, amen. That's a call and response culture. The social time perspective, meaning that time operates in a linear fashion, but we don't necessarily operate in a way that says that the exact time we schedule is the exact time we gonna show up. If I say I'm gonna have a barbecue at 5 o'clock, you know if you show up to that barbecue at 5 o'clock, you ain't gonna see nothing but some folded up chairs, some bags of charcoal. I might not even be at the crib yet myself. But it doesn't mean I'm late. You early. You call me at 8 o'clock, like, who all there? And that's when the barbecue may begin to start. Social time perspective, water emergent religion. Think about the baptismal. That's what King was talking about when he said we weren't afraid of Bull Connor's water hoses. He said because we knew water. He said if we were Christian Baptists, we were baptized in it. We might have had it sprinkled on us, but we knew water. He was saying that our religious traditions that emerged out of Africa situate us in such a way that water is connected to our spirituality. He said we knew water. Think about polyvocality, the multiple sounds happening at one time. When you listen to a Timbaland beat, you're not just listening to a whole bunch of drums. When you listen to Pharrell, you're not just listening to a bunch of sounds. When you hear a rap sample and you hear the sound over here and this over that, when you dig up a Kanye sample, the old Kanye. It's an attempt to link the present to the past. It's a marriage of sorts. there's a African quality to our work. There's an African quality to our production. And these kids that went in grandmama's basement and pulled out all them records, the turntable became an instrument. The turntable was no longer just a machine that played music. It turned into its own instrument. We ain't had no saxophone. We didn't have a trumpet. But we had that turntable, and that became our own instrument. It became our own literacy practice, a way of writing ourselves into history, a way of taking those different pieces that came together from different junctions in history, putting them together and producing them in a way that created something that had never been produced before. So when you hear a gospel sample, or when you hear Fela Kuti, and then you hear a Nina Simone, and then you see that link to a James Brown drum beat, and then you have new lyrics on top of it, and suddenly you have this whole new creation. That's what Ray Charles was doing too. There's a long history of this. When Ray Charles sings "I Got a Woman" way over town that's good to me, he's doing what? He's re-articulating a gospel song. I got a Savior way over in Jordan that saved my soul. Oh yeah. So then you go from that to I got a woman way over town that's good to me. So think about what Ray Charles is doing there. He's taking the sacred and making it secular. He's playing on irony in a way that might also cause a little bit of trouble. Think about the trickster out of the Eshu Alegba in West Africa. It all comes together. So now you got this trickster figure that Ray Charles is invoking by saying, I'm going to take this thing about my Savior over in Jordan, talking about the Jordan River, and bring it to my side option, way over town. So by the time you get to Kanye, think about the layers of nuance and meaning. You could just listen to Gold Digger and understand it, but what does it mean when you think, oh wait, he got Jamie Foxx singing the hook, who played Ray Charles in the movie, and now he's adding another thing to it. I ain't saying she a gold digger, right? But she ain't messing with no broke African Americans. So, it's sort of ironic given Kanye's politics, right? Because he's obsessed with a political party that actually doesn't really mess with broke niggas at all, right? So, he's kind of become that person, but that's a whole other conversation, no extra charge for that. So suddenly, within the hip hop context, you got underneath Gold Digger is Ray Charles and the Mississippi Mass Choir. The sacred and the secular, and it's all in there, and you don't even know it. You just listen to the song. But if you dig through it, there's layers of it. That's what these children in New York were doing in the 70s and 80s. That's what they were attempting to shape. But it's also important to understand that at the time, hip-hop was a locally constructed product. Hip-hop was about the local. It was about the relationship between the DJ, the MC, and the crowd. And remember, and early hip hop is not MC centric, it's DJ centric. That's important to understand too, because now we center the rapper, we center the MC. But before the rapper was the biggest show in town, the DJ was. And it wasn't about making albums for the world to consume, it was about making music to move the crowd. It was about the local mediated event, it was about the party, as Greg Demetriadis, may he rest in peace, talked about. So this becomes part of the conversation, the localness of it. So hip hop also has a local sensibility that allows us to draw on a different tradition. You see it in country music too, but it's a very interesting way that hip hop is obsessed with the local. That's why you know where Drake is from. That's why you know what house. You don't just know that Jay-Z is from Brooklyn. You know he's from Bed-Stuy. You know not just he's from Bed-Stuy. You know what housing project he's from. You know how rare it is to know what housing project somebody from? You don't know what housing project Willie Nelson from? You don't know what block Barbra Streisand grew up on? But there's something specific about hip-hop that fetishizes the local so that we want you to know where Lil Wayne is from. We want you to know where Nas is from. because it produces a certain kind of ghetto patriotism that is animated by a sense of despair and dislocation. In other words, I don't have much. I don't have full access to the American democratic promise. I don't have access to full voting rights. I don't have access to the labor market. I don't have access to all these forces. And so hip hop becomes a way to intervene in the public conversation and create my own sense of entitlement, my own sense of empowerment, my own sense of control, my own sense of agency. And for me, that might be the Queensbridge housing projects. It might be the Nolia housing projects. It might be a different place, but it allows me to do that in a way that gives me a sense of, it allows me to articulate my sense of humanity. This is part of what hip hop is attempting to do. I'm trying to write myself into the human space. So in New York, when I'm spray painting on the wall, this is at a moment where young folk are being denied access to public spaces. Remember the anti-loitering, for anybody who grew up in New York, the anti-loitering and anti-trespassing statutes that came up in the 80s and 90s. Suddenly, kids couldn't just hang on the corner after school. Kids couldn't just hang on the subway platform. So when I'm playing my big Radio Raheem, we used to call them ghetto blasters, when I'm playing that music, I am entering the public space sonically when I can't enter it physically. When you won't let me stand on the corner or go into the store and I write Taki on the wall, I am scarring public tissue. I am attempting to write my name and my space and my body and my identity in a world that would rather believe that I don't exist. Because the idea that these young folk don't exist is the very way that hip hop culture itself, though it emerges out of a culture of black, brown, male, and female ingenuity, it gets taken up and commodified in ways that exploit that ingenuity, utilize that ingenuity, and then marginalize the very people who created it, which is exactly what happened to Phyllis Wheatley. That's why it all comes together. I ain't just talking. Because you got Phyllis Wheatley, you got Frederick Douglass, you got Olana Equiano, you got David Walker, all these black writers who were told that they couldn't have written it by themselves. That's why all their books ended with written by himself. Written by herself, narrative of the life of Olana Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, written by himself. Autobiography of Frederick Douglass, written by himself. It wasn't axiomatic, it wasn't self-evident. It was called written by himself or written by herself because the world didn't believe that African people had the capacity to do it. Collins said, they didn't want me to do such and such, so I did it. That's out of a tradition of Olana Equiano when he writes at the beginning of his most famous document. He says what? I wholly entreat your pardon for putting before you a work so devoid of literary merit, written by an unlettered African. He's saying, y'all said I couldn't write this book, so I'm going to apologize for this book and say that it ain't good, even though it turns out to be one of the great literary productions of the century. Because you said we could not do it. Just like you said these hip-hop kids can't create art, but y'all make billions off the art every single year. Hip-hop is a global commodity that exploits the very people who you say are not human. The same way you say that these people like Phyllis Wheatley couldn't have written that book, even though at the same time you keep making laws to make it illegal for them to learn how to read and write. If we can't learn how to read and write anyway, why are you making laws to make it illegal to teach us how to read and write? What you stopping us for? But this is a very long and consistent pattern in American life that exploits black and brown bodies for their physical and intellectual and creative and spiritual gifts. At the same time, we exploit them and we erase them. We say you're lazy but make you a slave. We say you're dirty but you clean our houses. You say we're uncivilized and we raise your children. You say we're uncultured, but you can't have a TV commercial without a hip hop beat on it. They know who you are. We must. That's where hip hop studies comes in. That's where hip hop studies comes in. We're attempting to situate our production through a different lens. We're attempting to frame our experience through our own measures. Yes, I can look at the darkness of Biggie, his sonically, I don't mean black and ugly as ever, however I stay coochie down to the socks. Although that's an interesting thing as well, right? There's a certain kind of irony that he's playing with when he says that, right? But I'm talking about when he says, when I die, F it, I want to go to hell. Because I'm a piece of ish. It ain't hard to F and tell. It don't make sense going to heaven with the goody-goodies dressed in white. I want black Timbs and black hoodies. I mean, there's some interesting eschatology that's happening there. When we say eschatology, we're talking about a kind of understanding of how, and a study even of how the end of time, or the end of, within the religious context, how the end happens and what the end of time, end of days, end of human experience looks like from the perspective of a penultimate world. In other words, what does death look like? He's calling into question the God concept. He's asking questions of who and what God is. That's what Jay-Z's doing too. Listen to the intro to the Dynasty album. When he's talking back to God. Niggas say it's the dawn, but I'm superstitious. Niggas say it's the dawn, but I'm superstitious. Shit is as dark as it's been. Nothing is going as you predicted. Blueprint 2. My success in this game is sort of like progetic justice, a payment for brushes with police officers, a peace offering from the gods for the streets I was tossed in. What Weber would talk about as theodicy. The gap between destiny and merit, understanding the relationship between God and justice, trying to understand how good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. How do we reconcile that against the backdrop of a God who we recognize as all good within the particular Western religious context? How do we make sense of all this? Hip-hop is trying to help us make sense of this stuff. We can understand it through the lens of Weber. We can understand it through the lens of Schopenhauer. Why not? I could read Eminem and say, this iambic pentameter, man, this is downright Shakespearean. It's also ironic that they didn't start invoking the Shakespearean comparisons to hip-hop in the presence of iambic pentameter until Eminem came around, because he ain't the first or the last. Pharoah Monch is his father. That's a whole other conversation. But we could look at Royce da 5'9" and see the same thing. We could look at Kool Keith and look at his internal rhyme schemes, Dr. Octagon. We could look at the modernization of the hip-hop flow through Rakim and say, wait a minute, something interesting's happening here. And it's serious. It's cancer. Yep, old people get that reference. Thank you, sir. But hip-hop studies is not just to say we are as good as the Western canon. The point of hip-hop studies is not to say that, yes, we have cool stuff too. Look at us. We can be a Shakespearean and Shakespeare can. Yeah, that's cool. But to understand hip-hop is to understand it on its own terms. That means that we must create a new framework and a new vocabulary for understanding what we do. That means that rhythm is cool. But what about flow? There's something about the term flow in the presence of, in jazz, we talk about being in the pocket. Any jazz musicians in here? When somebody's in the pocket, it's something different. You can be on beat and not be in the pocket. Now, some folk is off beat. No doubt about that. But you can be on beat but not be in the pocket. And the Western jazz framework at the time didn't have the kind of discursive capacity to understand the pocket. But with you in the jazz club and you hear Coltrane, think about Coltrane in 64? Was that December 64? Love Supreme? Think about what it means to be in the pocket. Think about Coltrane at Temple a couple years later when he's having a spiritual awakening. And he's still in the pocket now because he's John Coltrane. He is the pocket. But then there's a moment where the saxophone can't contain his creative production and he starts to sing. And then when singing can't contain what he has, he starts beating his chest. How do we make sense of that in the context of Western literary analysis or Western jazz theory? There's something else there we got to do. We got to contribute something to make sense of it. Otherwise, we look as good as they do, but we don't understand who and what we are on our own terms. Same thing with hip hop. Yes, Jay-Z can rap, but there's something about Jay-Z's flow that's not enough to just say Jay-Z is on beat, because Eminem has learned how to rhyme on beat. And Eminem is dope. I love Eminem. This is not a diss of Eminem. Eminem is dope. But when you listen to Eminem 2 albums ago when he and Kendrick on the same song. They both on beat, they both rapping their behinds off that rapidy rap stuff. And the difference is there's something that Kendrick is doing that isn't easily legible. And it's not a black-white thing. It's not a race analysis I'm making, because Kanye ain't in the pocket either when he raps. If we keeping it 100, right? So it's not about race. It's about, although with my Trump theory, this could actually play out. We'll experiment with that later. But my point is, a whole bunch of folk don't rap in the pocket. But some folk do. And you know it when you hear it, because you're like, yo, that flow, that's something else. But we have to create our own vocabulary to make sense of it. We need to create our own vocabularies and intellectual frameworks to understand what's going on. And we also have to, before I go to questions, we also have to create our own intellectual frameworks for understanding the relationships between human beings and hip hop culture. In other words, we can't look at hip hop as purely textual. We can't just study rap lyrics and say, look how cool they are. Look how smart they are. Look how deep they are. Look how nuanced they are. We have to look at the fundamental relationships between human beings and texts. Why is that important? Because look at Nipsey Hussle. Victory Lap is an amazing album. I think it's the album of the year for sure. But the death of Nipsey Hussle and the reaction to the death of Nipsey Hussle is not just about the relationship between individuals and their reading of that, of Victory Lap or previous projects as a form of text. Just like when Tupac died, Tupac's death wasn't purely about the loss of Machiavelli. It was about a relationship that was larger than text that we form with hip hop culture. And part of what we have to do, in the 90s with hip hop studies, we spent so much time proving that hip hop could do certain intellectual work through the lens of the West. So you had wonderful books like Spectacular Vernaculars and other stuff that said, look, hip hop is a postmodern product. Cool, we got you. Then there's a stage where we say, all right, now we got to subject hip hop to some serious criticism. So you had these wonderful texts by folk like Trisha Rose, who's also an architect of this thing. But you had folks like Trisha Rose who's saying, wait a minute, we need to subject it to some serious, and T. Deneen Sharpley Whiting and others. We said, look, wait a minute, we need to subject hip-hop to some serious scrutiny because hip-hop has a masculinity problem, just like the world has a masculinity problem. We got to understand hip-hop as a site of homophobia, as a site of unhealthy masculinity, as a site of hypersexuality, as a site of misogyny, as a site of transphobia, as a site of transphobia. We have to understand hip-hop culture as it is and not be so committed to proving that we're human that we lose sight of the fact that we also need to be self-critical. We have to do that work, and we have to continue to do that work, and that work never stops. Because even in the conversation about Nipsey Hussle, there's a conversation to be had about masculinity and consumerism. We can talk about all this stuff. But there's also a conversation to be had about what those texts mean in our relationship to them. When Tupac died, people were saying people still saying Tupac alive. Now, you could dismiss that as black folk just being crazy. But people still think Elvis is alive. People still think Buddy Holly is still alive. I mean, when I was growing up, the checkout counter was filled with newspapers, Weekly World News and National Enquirer, Elvis sighting in Jamaica. Word? Elvis is in Jamaica? And ain't nobody noticed that? A 380-pound white man in the middle of Kingston. And yet, we allow it. My point, again, isn't to make a racial analysis at this moment, although I love racial analysis. It's to say that there's something about Tupac's significance for us that he became our first celebrity who we wanted to survive death. in a very similar way that people wanted Elvis to survive death, and they wanted Marilyn Monroe to survive death, and they wanted Buddy Holly to survive death. What is it about this Tupac story? Because we don't do that with Biggie. Biggie had an album, Life After Death. I mean, we're going to conjure conspiracy theories. We could do one with Biggie too, right? Ready to Die, Life After the Death, right? Life After Death. But there's something about that relationship we had to Tupac that was bigger than his music. Teasing out that relationship, understanding that relationship, understanding what Eminem means to a white kid in Detroit or Alabama or Madison, Wisconsin. What relationship does he form to Eminem that is bigger than or different than just the textual relationship? He might not even like the Marshall Mathers LP. He might not even he might think Machine Gun Kelly beat him in the battle, which I think he did, but there might be a relationship there that's different. What relationship do we have to Cardi B? And her particular performance of Latinidad? And the particular way that she's racialized. And the particular narratives that circulate around her identity. And the content of her music. Those relationships are bigger than the music. Hip-hop studies has to be about that. Hip-hop has to be about understanding affect. Hip-hop has to be about understanding relationships. Hip-hop has to be about understanding the transnational relationships of these texts. I'm in Jerusalem all summer, and then I go to Hebron. I'm in Khalil, Hebron, in the West Bank, and these people don't speak a word of English, and we're speaking Arabic. I'm interviewing them, and they were just very serious, very focused political organizers. And then the music came on, and all you heard was, Kiki, do you love me? Are you riding? And I'm like, I ain't see that coming. But there's something about the way that Western music is able to infiltrate, particularly American hip hop, is able to infiltrate various spaces, given the way that technoscapes happen, given the way that culturescapes happen, ethnoscapes, happen. In other words, the way that technology and money and culture circulates in the transnational context, it is very easy for American products to come. But what does that mean? What is the consequence of hip hop being a global phenomenon? And what does hip hop mean as a political tactic and as a tool of political resistance at this moment? Because we often talk about and romanticize hip hop as a site of political resistance. We'd have to ask ourselves, is hip hop at this moment a site of political resistance? What are we resisting and how? Are we resisting patriarchy? Are we resisting capitalism, or do we just want to be part of it? What are the questions that we're asking? But we also have to decenter, finally, the United States from hip hop studies. Because when I go to Cuba, when I go to Tanzania, when I'm in Arusha, and I'm listening to hip hop acts there, they have access to American hip hop, but what's interesting, what I find is that initially they rap like Americans do. Like, you ever hear the Orishas back in the 2000s? Y'all know the Orishas? The Orishas were a Cuban hip hop group that made this wonderful album called A Lo Cubano. And it sounded just like American hip hop, just like in Spanish. And then over time, the music starts to be dipped into the waters of their own culture, their own traditions. Now, it's Cuban, so there's still that African drum, but there's some other stuff happening too. So now the sample might not be James Brown, it might be Celia Cruz. That could be interesting. It might not be a reference to Aretha, it might be a reference to Jose Marti. So it gets interesting. And then they begin to use hip hop as a tool to resist whatever political forces they're trying to resist in their own nation state, but on their own terms. And so as we begin to study hip hop, let's not just look at hip hop in the United States. Let's ask what hip hop Japan looks like Ian Condrey did. Let's ask what hip hop looks like in Brazil. Let's look at what resistance looks like, and let's commit ourselves to studying and rigorously analyzing and finally protecting hip-hop studies in the academy, because we are at a moment where the university has become increasingly technocratic. where universities are much more like multinational corporations and institutions of higher learning. That's all of them. And what ends up happening is at the same time that labor gets casualized and tuition goes up, and you have more adjuncts than tenure track professors, and the neighborhoods get colonized through gentrification of major universities, and you begin to see all of these things happening. We also begin to see certain things that don't make money become disposable. In K-12 education, we see it all the time. In the age of high-stakes testing, there's fewer music programs, there's fewer arts programs, and suddenly all we want is the stuff that you take on that high-stakes test to make AYP, and that's all we care about. That becomes part of the problem. In the university, it becomes the same framework. So Black studies is now under fire again. Women's studies is under fire again. Queer studies is under fire again. And so we have to protect these things, but we also have to protect these things by doing it well. Because some of this work ain't good. We have to respect the form, respect the genre, and respect our tradition enough to do high quality, rigorous, engaging hip hop work. I'm gonna stop there. Let's do some Q&A. Is that cool? All right, cool.